So before we go ahead and get started, we're going to begin with a land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of Indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham and Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and Indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. So quickly going to take a moment to introduce the seminar series. So the Native Voices in STEM seminar series is co-sponsored by the Indigenous Resilience Center, the University of Arizona, Sloan Indigenous Graduate Partnership, the Water Resources Research Center, the Native Fuse Alliance, and the Office of Societal Impact. This seminar series highlights Native scientists, engineers, educators, leaders, and social activists, providing students with an opportunity to network and learn about the research and careers of Native leaders in various fields. Each session includes a Q&A segment at the end where all attendees are encouraged to engage with the speaker, ask questions, and participate in the discussion. So today I'd like to introduce Dr. Gregory Cajete, who's a renowned Indigenous educator and whose work centers on weaving Native knowledge systems into contemporary education. His current talk, Creating a Mindful Science Through Indigenous Eyes, explores how Indigenous ways of knowing illuminate deeper relationships between science, spirit, land, and community. He invites us to reconsider science not only as a method of inquiry, but as a lived relational practice rooted in creativity, interdependence, and cultural understanding. Dr. Cajete brings decades of experience in Indigenous education, ecological thought, and culturally grounded scholarship that continues to shape how we think about teaching, learning, and sustainability. And so if we could please take a moment to welcome Dr. Cajete.
Sengi Tamo, as we say in Tewa, from Santa Clara Pueblo. It's really a pleasure to have this opportunity to address you and to really introduce you to another dimension, I guess you would say, of my work. You know, if you want to follow some of my presentations, I'm really popular on YouTube. So you just Google my name and multiple, actually far too many kinds of presentations come up, most of which I've forgotten that I did and where I did it. But there's a lot of content there in terms of presentations. And those are kind of my usual, my usual kinds of PowerPoint presentations that I give in various places. This one is a little different. This one takes you into my world as a researcher of curriculum, of culturally responsive curriculum. So this is my education cap, and more particularly my research cap in the context of this presentation. It's actually the introduction to a new manuscript that I've just finished with the same title, Creating Indigenous Mindful Science Through Indigenous Eyes. And it's about really looking at how we can begin to bring forward the Indigenous ways of knowing and thinking, the relational philosophies, the mindful understandings into higher education. Now, I've done this before, and I've worked in many different ways and contexts with curriculum for K through 12, for Native schools, for Native curriculum programs and projects. I'm currently involved with a whole project through the Lano Foundation, Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory, and its attempt to sort of put together a relevant Indigenous science curriculum for teachers of and around the northern New Mexico area. So I'm currently actually involved with a K through 12 project as well. I also work as a contractor for New Mexico Highlands University, where we're trying to create what is called an Indigenous knowledge roadmap, which is basically a strategy for integrating Indigenous thought into higher education curriculum as well. So this is a kind of continuation, embellishment, and actually extension of that kind of work. It is different than my usual fare, as I said, but I hope you enjoy it. And in many ways, what I'm doing right now and what I'm going to do is really create a kind of argument for the importance of this kind of intervention, if you will, into higher education. It has a lot of relevancy for higher education science in STEM fields, but it also has a lot of possibilities for also the integration of Indigenous thought into the social sciences, into the arts, into everything basically that is done within higher education systems. And one of the reasons why I'm doing this is because I've worked with another student of mine actually has a program at Colorado State University in which she has 12 Indigenous students, and they're involved with various aspects of STEM, natural resources. And I've been working with them for 3 years. And in the many conversations I've had with them, what has come through is that the frustrations, the issues they have in taking science courses within the academy are very similar to the kinds of issues I had 52 years ago at the Highlands University as I was taking my program in biology. And I realized that while things have changed, there has been a lot of money popped into recruitment, into various kinds of programs that acclimate Native students to STEM and other, college programs that in terms of the actual curriculums that still are taught in science programs, that very little actually has not changed. Very little has changed in terms of at least the ethos, I guess you might say, that guides those. So that came forward as one of their major concerns, frustrations. As it turns out, if you talk to a lot of STEM students and they're being honest with you, they will also say the same thing. They have huge frustrations with the way that science is taught in the traditional kind of canon within various STEM fields. So it's not just an Indigenous issue at this point. Why does it matter? Because we need more Native scientists. We need more in all fields. We need more scientists, period. In the context of the workforce, we need scientists to do so many different things and to address some of the really real challenges that we have, with climate change and certainly with other kinds of situations that require science expertise, but also require a relational understanding. And so Curriculum for Creating Mindful Science is about this. So I'll get started and see if I can get this to change. Okay. You can tell that we're all challenged by new technologies. Okay. So as you can, read along with me because I'm going to jump around in these PowerPoints given our time. But as I say here, the question that I'm addressing is how can a way of thinking about teaching and application of science be created that builds upon Indigenous relational philosophies, ways of knowing, creative exploration, and application to Indigenous and global issues. Indigenous science really is, when you study it in depth, it's a complex, adaptive, cultural, social, emotional, psychological, philosophical system. Okay, that's a mouthful. But it's a system of thought. It's a complex system of thought and action and has historical, social, cultural, ecological, and spiritual components that have a past, a present, and potential future in terms of expressions that can be researched and taught to create what I call mindful science. Now, I'm using the term mindful, not so much in the transcendental, meditative, context that many people are used to, but mindful is really focused attention. Ultimately, when you boil it down to what is mindfulness, mindfulness is sustained, focused attention on something. okay? And certainly indigenous forms of science have been exactly that. They stem from and they evolve from attention to issues and environments, plants and to animals and to cosmos. And that's why I use the term mindfulness, because they are mindfully created. They come from mindful sources, cultural and otherwise. So some of the key events that I'm studying, you can tell that this is very different than I usually present. I'm talking from kind of the research voice. And so I'm studying these events, key events in relationship include history of indigenous science before colonization, changes that occurred in the nature of indigenous science because of colonization, the present state of indigenous participation in science, the effect on indigenous people learning and practicing Western science that current paradigms of teaching and science have caused. So, in a relational, when you're doing relational work, you're looking at all the different kinds of impacts that are happening because of what you're doing, okay? And those become a part of your understanding of what you're doing. So current educational context for indigenous science renewal and revitalization, case studies, community renewal, community-based, because indigenous education traditionally was focused around and in and through the community. It happened in that context. Colonization caused it to be moved into the Western educational context, and we've been dealing with that in indigenous education ever since. And it's also about the future of indigenous science and the role of community place-based education. So if you look at the indigenous world of education, you'll see that there's a lot of emphasis now in what is called place-based curriculum, place-based education, focus on localization of understanding and knowledge. So again, as we move forward with this idea of what are important, some of the things that guided me included, what is our relationship with the natural world as indigenous people? What is that based on? Where the highest value is appropriate balance of relations. So when you study indigenous epistemologies, you're studying these kinds of credos, if you will, these kinds of principles. And then also, my opinion is that indigenous science actually can reinvent itself based on historic traditions of community science knowledge combined with positive integration of Western science knowledge in creative and regenerative ways. So it's a bringing together of two worlds of science. It can be revitalized or reinvented in creative, regenerative, sustainable ways by concentrated focus on indigenous philosophies, values, sense of history, and a vision for the future of indigenous community. So because indigenous communities were the locus of indigenous knowledge, indigenous education, it's about also bringing now back to the community and empowering the community to again become, a true partner in that context of educating, that way of education. Again, we're having to do because the clicker's not working. So learning in community then becomes a real important, component of this thinking about curriculum. And as I said, I'm a curriculum designer, curriculum researcher. This is kind of my bread and butter. This is what I do all the time, create programs, based on these ideas. So, in terms of the learning constructs, application of indigenous science through various forms of community-based education was the norm in indigenous communities. There's a pressing need to revive this form of applied community science, education, and community building in contemporary expressions unique to the needs and situations of indigenous peoples and communities. The development of indigenously informed relational science methodologies are key to this process. I have a credo: community is both the medium and the message. Our strengths and our ability to be resilient in the face of colonization, in the face of dramatic modernization and cultural change, has been the strength of our communities. And so the community, of course, has its own ecology, and it's also impacted by all of the historical and social factors that we know today exist in our communities. But really, the community is still the medium and the message. It is the place where the culture, in a sense, emerges from. So we are starting to do a lot of this kind of work in terms of place-based curriculums. We're looking at how we can actually begin to bring together, this importance of community, build the community at the same time, empower the community in terms of its own knowledge. We know that we've lost lots of elders. We've lost a lot of that traditional knowledge, but we also have the ability to re-research, that knowledge, that history, and bring it forward in new and contemporary ways of expression. And so that's really thinking about how do you use Indigenous science, Indigenous knowledge, to bring us forward into a better future. So again, past, present, and future coming together in that paradigm. Next. So purpose. The result of a series of conversations. I had a lot of conversations about this over the last 50 years. Literally, with colleagues, with students, with everyone, community members, elders, so this is not just coming out of the blue. This is a long-term, if you will, research project spanning my entire career as an educator, since my time at the Institute of American Indian Arts. So I've done a lot of research, and you can see that, it's based on philosophy, mindfulness, community building. I've written books about community, written books about, curriculum, undergraduate curriculum. But really what's eluding us is really to find a cohesive Indigenous theory of how we go about doing this. The theory guides you in terms of how you go about implementing some of these ideas and perspectives. So for an educator, curriculum and curriculum design and curriculum research is the way that we implement ideas in a teaching and learning environment. And so this is what I'm using, the whole notion of community in this way. Let's see if we can, okay, there we go. All right, so one of the things that really is also guiding me in this proposal, if you will, is the fact that despite all of our efforts, there's low participation of Native people in science and STEM-related fields. As I was looking up, particularly in the realm of PhDs, the most recent data that I could find, because it's hard data to find because it's such an insignificant number. The number of PhDs in the last 5 years remained at about 0.6% of total PhDs given in all schools. I have to say, Arizona, New Mexico, some of our southwestern schools, have more PhDs than most colleges and universities, but still, it's not anywhere near, our representation in the population. So there's still a huge, huge gap. Masters, there's a few more students graduating with master's degrees in STEM fields. Undergraduates, still a few more. But what is happening as the students move into higher education, higher levels of STEM, education and research? So that became a question for me. So as it says up there, the lack of participation continues to be a substantial challenge. American Indian participation in science is much due to the alienation of the traditions of Western science as a lack of access to or alienation from Western traditions of science, as to the access to science education, bad training, or any other reasons given. Contrary to the general insistence that Western scientists are, that science is not culture bound, that it produces good. Many Native people feel that science and scientists are thoroughly Western rather than universal, and that science is negative. Way back when I started this kind of research, I had the honor of working with Raina Green, who was a Cherokee, and working with Washington agency that was looking at, Native participation in science. So even way back in 1981, we knew that there was an issue with this participation. And we also had a sense of why that was. I'm trying to get this to work. I'm sorry. Okay, next slide. I'll go ahead and have you just go ahead and do that, if you can. Okay, so I did a lot of studies, I did a lot of research in terms of and see, this is some of the things I found. Though extensively studied, Native American participation and successful completion of degrees has dropped below 1%, where enrollment has historically been since the 1970s. So this trend is, and so the most recent, one of the graduate students I worked with in Arizona State, Linda Tello, a Peruvian indigenous person, contends that this is the effect of contemporary science teaching, because most educational interventions have considered only values and norms of dominant middle-class white culture in their identification of best practices, leading to a standard that does disservice to both scientific inquiry processes and the students of color, who must stretch beyond their cultural repertories to adapt to unfamiliar norms. And so the literature actually supports all of these kinds of things. It's kind of a hidden literature. You have to look actually for these kinds of perspectives, but nonetheless, it's there. Others have researched it. Members of the population that are not statistically represented are placed in environments that, through the questions of scientific inquiry, become environments that mirror and replicate culturally specific beliefs and pay little attention to for whom and under what conditions new innovations in practice are best implemented. While there is enough research to support interventions, it's rarely done. It's rarely done in the curriculums of higher education. If it is done at all, it's because a professor or an organization has the wherewithal, to sort of move forward to make things happen in the curriculum. But most part, it does not happen in higher education curriculum. So the standard canon continues to be taught the way it has always been taught, ad infinitum. So these biases include existing curriculums do not support Indigenous identities, lack of knowledge of Indigenous perspectives. Indigenous culture is taught in isolation from other subject areas. Ethnocentric pedagogies do not create space for other ways of knowing. Okay, there we go. So we don't come to that 1% threshold. So a lot of the participation of Native people in science STEM fields is not really registered. It's there. You have to search for it, but it really is not a part of policy development or any of the other kinds of interventions that you have to base on evidence, okay? So, one of my colleagues, has said, Sharon Nelson Barber, who's really a native woman with West Ed, has been tracking all of this kind of statistics for quite some time. And she says basically it's, one of the reasons policy doesn't change is because the statistics show that we are under 1%, of the population in science-related fields. Other biases include existing curriculums, as it says, do not really support Indigenous identities. And I'm going backwards here. Lack of resources and materials, lack of funding, biases that are institutionalized in thought and behavior, in our cultural and also legal systems, educational systems, opportunities for Indigenous, these continue to exist. So they also compound the problem. The idea of recognizing Indigenous knowledges, building bridges between Native and Western knowledge, practical methods for interpreting Native knowledge in Western science classrooms are essential. Recognizing the international resurgence of Indigenous cultures and sovereignty and human rights is essential. So what I'm saying essentially is that there's a huge body of knowledge, a huge body of data, a huge body of research that has been done about this. But very, very little has changed within our higher education systems to address this very obvious discrepancy. So let me just Native people are ideally, just as smart as anyone else, but in terms of the biases that exist and continue to exist, those are the impediments, I guess you might say, to access to higher education STEM. The way that courses are aligned and taught within STEM don't include that Indigenous perspective or identity. And just the stress of taking a STEM course of study, because it's coming from a completely different worldview and space than Indigenous students, all of that causes what I call a kind of ethno-stress. And this is the kind of frustration that many students feel. The students that I talked with and conversed with at Colorado State University, almost to the person, expressed this same idea of the kinds of stress they felt in these programs. So, one of the things they did say was introducing Indigenous knowledge into the teaching of STEM in higher education would be very helpful and would be very important to them and would be something they could resonate and identify with. And one of the keys to accomplishing this is really creating higher education curriculum that addresses this issue. Now, we've done a lot of this in K through 12, in the Indigenous education world. I mean, the last 50 years, that's what I've been working on, and it's still going on. It's not going on in higher education in any real or relevant sense. There are bright spots, and those bright spots happen when there are dedicated individuals, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, that really act as mentors and act as supporters of students who are in STEM. That's a start, but the curriculum has not changed. So one of the reasons why I'm putting together, and I've written actually a whole curriculum, was really to address this idea of really beginning to do the kind of work that we have always been doing in lower grades, in K through 12, but bringing that forward now into higher education and higher education curriculum design and development. It's going to require work. Because it hasn't been happening in any concerted way in higher education STEM. So this underrepresentation, in science and technology fields, helping teachers really understand that how they may themselves contribute to this marginalization of Native students in the classroom, how they may change this scenario by introducing Indigenous knowledge to increase Native student interest and participation, and participation is key. Now, I'm not saying that this isn't happening. This is happening in some ways, in some places, probably here at University of Arizona, and I know it happens at University of New Mexico, but it's not happening anywhere near the level that it needs to happen, to make some difference in this quandary, in this situation. I wish this clicker was working better. So perceptions and issues, there are reasons why this whole scenario exists. And as I said, there are economic roots, unemployment, even for educated Indians, it's difficult to find jobs in our Indigenous communities, once we graduate with our masters or PhDs. Physical conditions of our communities, poor infrastructure and equipment, sociological roots, such as family and community problems, weighed down many Indigenous students. Institutional programmatic roots, such as history of materials and systems that are culturally inappropriate at best and assimilation at worst. So when I look at a situation like this, I look at the ecology. This is relational thinking. So there's the issue, but what surrounds the issue? What is it connected to? What are the threads that are also impacting what is happening in this situation? And so you look at this as an ecology, because it's not just one thing. It usually is multiple kinds of things acting together in consort with each other. There's also longstanding mistrust of governmental and educational institutions, poor individual community health, polarization, infighting in various groups. So this is happening within Indigenous communities that also contribute, to this issue. And so this is, so Native students, coming to college and university is still a struggle. It's still significantly a struggle to be here in an institution like the University of Arizona. And also added to this is the impact of sometimes exploitive control by federal and corporate entities, which through various political and otherwise self-serving policies perpetuate weak social governance and economic structures, all of which lack the participation of STEM education. All of these affect, this participation of in STEM education. So another colleague of mine, Doug Maitland and Megan Bang, wrote a book a few years ago about this whole situation. Their book is entitled Who's Asking Native Science, Western Science, and Science Education. And they contend that the very structure of science curriculum in most educational settings reflects an entrenched way of seeing science as being done only in one true way, with only one true set of values, seeing only one way to do work, to do and to work in science, and only one true curriculum for science. They believe that such bias orientation must be challenged and transformed towards a paradigm that acknowledges the relational nature of science and creates and supports science and education for all. So that was based on a comprehensive research of higher education curriculum by Doug Menden and Megan Bang. They suggest self-determination through community engagement with ownership of science and science education may be the most important outcome for Native communities and Native people engaged in science and technology-related fields. So again, the community-based piece is coming, forward as being an important way to begin this reorientation, if you will, of Native science, or integration of Native science, rather. They also contend that science depends on who's doing it. They believe that it's not only simple of everyone doing the same thing, but not in the same way, but a matter of doing different things done in different ways for different purposes that are constrained by different cultural and social values. So what they're introducing here is an ecological frame of thought into this whole notion. And really, it's an argument against one size fits all, which is largely what is practiced in higher education science. One size fits all. The reality, the social reality, is that one size does not fit all. Because of cultural diversities, because of diversities of learning styles, we have to have a kind of curriculum that allows for and addresses that reality of diversity. So this idea, contrary to prevailing assumptions, science is slow to self-correct. Entrenchment of the notion of one truth, one way continues to dominate. And so what happens now is there is an intractable conflict that has arisen. There's a reality, there's an indigenous perspective, there's a way of understanding this notion of relationality on the one side. And there, on the other side, there's only one way to do science, one way to view science, one way to understand science. And so ultimately it's oil and water, right? So what they're saying basically is that this has to really be challenged. And it has to be challenged actually not only for the good of Indigenous people, but for the good of the enterprise of science itself and the way that science happens in a multicultural, diverse, human global society that is ever becoming more diverse. And so in many ways, what they're saying essentially is that science is not keeping up with the realities of the populations that it is teaching in STEM fields. And researching this, most STEM curriculums are designed for about a quarter of the students who have that kind of learning style, that way of thinking and that very rationalistic, specific way of looking at things, that kind of logic. And then the other 3/4 of the students in the classroom have to adapt. If they're not able to adapt, they're not gonna pass the science course, period. And my professors, I remember in the early 70s, were telling me exactly the same thing. You either sink or swim, and if you can do it, you can do it. If not, too bad. Take something else. Become an artist. So, or go into Indigenous studies, So, so these are real, situations. And in some cases, this is really not an expose. As I said, research shows that all of this is true. But, I think that really, interestingly enough, and I've noticed this, that Native science, when I came out and talked about the history of Native science and the extensive and elegant systems of knowledge systems that we had as Indigenous people at one time, largely that whole notion was dismissed as, well, that's history. That's not really science, And so that idea of one truth, continues to be the conditioning of many, many academics. Why does it have to change? Well, just not only for the sake of Indigenous people, more participation of Indigenous people in sciences, but it has to change, I think, because science has to become I'm going to say that the word democratized. It has to become more democratic. It has to become more inclusive. And so, in curriculum, we design for certain kinds of outcomes. It's a design process. And so when you do curriculum research, you're designing for a certain kind of outcome. And so you can design outcomes that are very specifically focused on one truth, one worldview, or you can design curriculums that actually are more expansive, more inclusive, more diverse, that accept that there can be multiple ways of doing science, of understanding science, of perceiving science. And that's why Indigenous science is kind of an anomaly, okay, in the science world. It becomes a kind of anomaly. And let me tell you, I've had hot debates with scientists over this one precept. But as they're saying, structuring of science education in most education settings reflects this entrenchment of science being done in only one true way and only one true curriculum. But they suggest that self-determination through community engagement with the ownership of science and science education may be one of the most important outcomes for Native communities engaged in these science and technology fields. And I've said that already. So I'm coming to kind of the end. We're almost at the hour. So all of this then, focuses now on why does Greg Cajete want to create this outlandish one, some people will call it outlandish curriculum. Well, first of all, I have the confidence of experience of having done this already at the Institute of American Indian Arts and raising students from the idea that there's no science in Native culture. And why do we have science in this art school? To we love science, and we would love to learn more about our own forms of Indigenous science, and actually considering becoming scientists through the process of a curriculum design that brings that notion forward. So what I'm contending is that what has happened, in many ways, in lots of different ways, because a lot of Indigenous educators have been concentrating on creating these kinds of culturally responsive, culturally relevant science curriculums for students in their communities, in their schools. And they're seeing the progress that is being made, that same progress can happen in the higher education curriculum. But it's going to take time. It's going to take the energy. It's going to take a lot of different ways of approaching a lot of research. But do we have time to do that? Gregory Cajete is very impatient in this regard. So I went ahead and I created a curriculum. So I'm going to show you the curriculum quickly, and then we'll finish this. There's a lot of research that says diversity of thought in modern science matters. So other researchers, non-native, have said this, have reflected on this. What they are also advocating is that we have to create curriculum and space for this kind of education to take hold. So hence, this is the idea of mindfully constructed Native science. The barriers are going to continue in terms of the many different kinds of challenges that we have to address. But one of the most cited barriers continues to be the lack of culturally responsive science curriculum in K-12 schools, colleges, and universities, which engage Native American learners in science and math. As we move forward with this, I guess I'm going to just really end with telling you a little bit about the curriculum that I've already designed. It is already designed, in the sense that that I've created a kind of template. This took me literally 344 pages to actually line the whole thing out. But this is just a sample of what it looks like. And in this, I'm using a tried and true Western curriculum research model, curriculum design and research model created by Robert Zayas in 1970, actually, in which he creates a rubric, which includes foundations, 4 foundations, and atop those 4 foundations sit 4 components. Each one of the boxes in the rubric require a certain kind of design and research process, information in order to, address that particular part of the rubric. But essentially, as you can see, it begins with the first foundation is the epistemology, the cultural base of the knowledge that you're going to teach from, the indigenous base, the tribal base, that culture's thought, philosophy, knowledge, content. The aim, again, and objectives of the curriculum is to how to actually integrate that knowledge and how to teach for it, how to learn about it. Then the second piece is the cultural, social context, why you're doing it in the first place. The society and culture, know your audience as a collective. The content themes many times are drawn from both the epistemology and the social foundation. Because, what I'm talking about in terms of why there is lack of participation continues to be in science, that's the social foundation. But the epistemology is our philosophies, our ways of knowing, the relational psychology that's involved with indigenous science. All of that becomes, also things that you teach about in the curriculum. And then the learning context, the learners and their learning characteristics, know your audience as individual learners. So in some ways, the curriculum has to be individualized. You have to understand who you're teaching, where they're coming from, what their context is. And then you develop the kinds of learning activities that match their learning styles, match their learning experience, that help them to understand and to learn based on their strengths of learning. And then, of course, out of that emerges, because the Zayas model is designed to create a theory at the end, an understanding of what is working, why is it working that way. So it actually creates theory. But you can also use standing theories in the context of that. And then, of course, the evaluation. We developed indigenous evaluation almost 20 years ago, an indigenous evaluation model. I was a part of the research team that did that. It was commissioned by the AHEC, American Indian Higher Education Consortium. And it was really to address the lack of the indigenous view in the whole process of evaluation and evaluation research. And so it exists already. But again, just like the other research I pointed to, very little of it is used. It exists, it has been done, it has been piloted, it has been tested, but very little of it, because there are social factors and there are institutional politics that prevent it, in a sense, from really fully being engaged. So that's the social component. So what happens with these kinds of curriculums, once you get them going, is that you learn about everything else. You learn about the context in which science is happening, the context in which science is being taught, the context in which the student is learning about science. And so it becomes really a much more holistic way of viewing and understanding the teaching and learning of science. So of course, one of the most important things, and I'll finish with this, is that we first have to understand in a very deep way what indigenous epistemology is. How do indigenous people come to know what they know? How do tribes understand themselves as a unique tribal people in the place and in the space from which they are embedded. And based on that history, you can begin to create what I call culturally responsive curriculum in ways that are meaningful, that address the issue, I think, in some very real ways of participation of Indigenous people to a greater extent in STEM. Now, I have to say some of this is already happening, you know, in different places and spaces, in different organizations. Because I've been in different kinds of situations where I hear the students talking about this. The key, though, is that it happens within conversations that are happening in the way that teachers or professors are teaching science in which they have Native students. And that's the big political hurdle, institutional hurdle, you know, that exists in all universities that have Native populations. So I leave you with a problem, and then I'm going to run away and do this to someone else. But I leave you with that challenge and that problem. You know, we have the wherewithal and we have the data really to really begin to create some really innovative. And I have to say that a lot of science programs are really realizing, yeah, Indigenous knowledge is important. Let's learn about it. Let's teach about it. And in some cases, you just have to do more of that. And you have to simply organize. So what the curriculum does is it organizes your teaching and learning in a way that's cohesive and consistent and systematically does, you know, address the aim of more participation of Native people in science STEM fields because they feel it's relevant to them personally and also to the people that they serve in their communities. So again, I said this is going to be a very different kind of Greg Cajete presentation. I have lots of glitzy YouTube videos that you can watch. But this one is very important to me because this is what I'm advocating is a systemic change. You know, it's kind of the next step in Indigenous education. So as an Indigenous educator globally, the next step for us as Indigenous educators is to really begin to address what is Indigenous education theory in a contemporary expression. We study it in a traditional setting, and there's plenty of history and material, you know, to study. But translating that into contemporary expression is the real creative act. And that's where we're kind of at, you know. So, you know, beginning a long time ago with my colleagues, Graham and Linda Smith, as they created this whole notion of kaupapa Maori, you know, learning through Indigenous knowledge about Indigenous situations with Indigenous people, you know, and out of that came, let's produce 500 Maori PhDs, you know, to do this work. And they're close to, if not now, beyond 500 Maori PhDs. That same idea really is the idea, and that same kind of vision is the same kind of vision that we need today in terms of turning around that 0.6% of Native PhDs, you know, to, and I'm not sure exactly how the number that includes, but that's the very small, to, you know, having hundreds of Native PhDs in science-related fields. So with that, as we say in my language, we kundang baikibo bihan buwetsiki. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your breath with me. And I guess I'm open for some questions if we have some time. I guess.
Cool. Actually, before we go to questions,
Yeah.
So for everybody in the room, Stitdash, Aniana, Jugi, Guanada, Rola, Nasia, Karchan, Buyaka, Bacha, Iwasaha, Makuhana, Yukasha, Wana, Kohen, good day, everybody. My name is Winona Lila Ignacio. I am Lakota and Banaatam. I am a third-year law student over at the College of Law over there. One of my jobs is I work for the Indigenous Resilience Center. I'm the Waverly Street Grant Project Assistant, but also very in touch with the culture and whatnot. I do all of this alongside my best friend Trinity Norris, the one who's taking pictures of y'all. But yeah, we just wanted to give our thanks to Dr. Cajete. Part of that is, making sure you feel welcome, that hopefully you feel like we took care of you while you were here.
Oh, you did? Yeah.
But, really just commending you for everything you've stated. And for us, as Native students, it is really refreshing to hear that, you do validate the struggle that we go through even now today still. And, at this institution, this place doesn't really support Native students, but it comes on to us to find these homes, find these pockets, find these safe spaces of community. With IRAs, we're really able to do that. And I really appreciate that about our workplace. Very appreciative of everything that we've been able to do, all the people that we're able to bring in, all these like cool Native scientists. And I even shared this, with Dr. Cajete, but, we're so much smarter than the Americans in Western academia, and they couldn't handle that. So they created traditional ecological knowledge, oh, put it over there. Even him stating like, oh, like, if this isn't good enough for you, then go do Indigenous studies. All of us have a story like that. All of us have that feeling of being made to feel like we were less than, or that we weren't as smart as our American cohort, which is in reality, we're way smarter than them. They can't even keep up with us. And it's really refreshing to be able to hear that, to experience that, and be able to share this with y'all. I'm always so appreciative of everything that we're able to do, to have these pockets of home, pockets of community, especially, for us res kids, who come from the res, who are homegrown, and being able to see it like that. So yeah, we just, us being Optum, we just wanted to give you some shells, so that that you have a place here. And, for us as Optum, I always say that we're very, we take care of people. As long as you don't do us wrong, we're gonna take care of you. My best friend and I, our thing has always been about making sure that students know they have a home, have a community, making sure that they know that the people who come around us, that they know they're gonna be safe with them. And that's all what we're about. And so wanting to extend that to you, and that our students at least feel that. And so just giving you a little piece of our home, something to connect you to the Jewett. So.
Okay. Yeah.
Put them on, or you can.
Thank you. It matches my shell tight necktie here. Yeah. Well, thank you again for your, kind attention. Again, I didn't present you the 344 pages, death by PowerPoint, segment of this, but it is actually already finished. I'm doing the final draft, and then now looking for a publisher to find someone who's brave enough to publish, this kind of a curriculum. It's designed actually for if you're a Native student and you want to go deeper into Native science, that it's a parallel curriculum. It's a self-teaching, self-motivating, process that you can actually do yourself. You don't need an institution. It's helpful to have good research and good research library, but you don't necessarily need that. You just need, and it's also based on Indigenous scholars' books. Had the honor of really working with so many Indigenous scholars over these 52 years as an educator. And their knowledge and is valuable. And I wanted to highlight that in this curriculum. So the curriculum, the content is actually books by Indigenous authors that touch on different dimensions of Native science, Native philosophy. And that's what gives you the grounding in this kind of thinking of mindful relational science that parallels Western science and also adds to it in so many different kinds of ways. So it's a both and curriculum. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Before the student mentoring session. And we already have one question online, which is, do you think we will ever have an Indigenous STEM education program that will be fully implemented?
Everything is a possibility. And I think that as time goes by, as some of this actually is happening in tribal colleges. in bits and pieces. I've been in even TOCC, Tohono O'odham Community College. We've implemented, Indigenous science curriculum, Indigenous knowledge into their teaching of science. So these processes are already underway, and they are certainly, possible in terms of fully implementing this. A lot of the barriers to full implementation come as a result of certain kinds of barriers that funding agencies, sort of present to the college or the program that's trying to implement some of these ideas. So it's really negotiating those kinds of barriers in ways that allow us to really more fully implement and complement these. So a lot of our curriculums in tribal colleges have been preparing students to go on into Western science programs. But even in those cases, the students are prepared to go from tribal colleges to, let's say, Western universities or institutions. But even those students have issues once they get into, they may be prepared, in terms of the basics of the science, but they still have issues that I'm talking about in terms of the way that science gets taught in the university setting. So, so we're moving gradually away from, doing that to actually then now creating our own curriculums, cohesive curriculums. And I'm hoping that that will be the future of tribal college education, that they move to more comprehensively, as TOCC is attempting to do as we speak, more comprehensively include Indigenous thinking into the way science is taught at that college. All right.
William Pacheco, if you can hear me, if you want to unmute yourself.
Sure. Kondawoha, Dr. Cajete. My name is William Pacheco from Kiwa, San Domingo, Pueblo.
Yeah.
I'm currently finishing a Master of Science here at MIT in linguistics. And
Nice.
so one of the things that I want to do is to use linguistics as an inroad into STEM. Using a course here at MIT, we use scientific inquiry for
Yes.
this is where generative linguistics started. And so using that, has there been any kind of inroads with that for indigenous knowledge and such, using linguistics as a inroad for STEM?
Not that I'm aware of, but it's a really good idea that you've just given me, because one of the areas that also a lot of Native peoples have struggled with is the way that language is taught from a linguistic standpoint, because you almost have to have a linguistic degree to be able to decipher, systems and approaches. Although it's a good research system, this is a barrier sometimes. And so working, along these lines of thinking about how to reform the linguistics curriculum and the way that linguistics is taught into a more indigenous friendly kind of way of doing linguistics, I think is really important, because this is one of the areas that a lot of Native people do participate in, in terms of language preservation and revitalization. But I know that even here at the University of Arizona, in its wonderful linguistics program or native language program, that there are a lot of issues with the way that linguistics is approached and used, So yeah, I don't have any specific, recommendations at this point, but I think it's an important, area to explore in terms of how do you create curriculum that actually is more culturally responsive for native language education. So thank you for that question. Appreciate it. Wikundawa.
Thank you.
Yes.
This is more of a current event question. Considering the tidal wave of attack on science that occurred in 2025 and is ongoing right now,
Yeah.
Do you think that this introduces a new opportunity for a new science paradigm? And if so, like, how do we do that with the right people?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that question forward because this actually is happening. There is a lot of research already in Western science and Western science journals that are talking about, how do we begin to change the Western paradigm of science to be more inclusive. So this has been an ongoing debate, conversation, within Western science for quite some time. And so I'm hoping that as this evolves, that there is going to be more openness, to having these conversations. But the conversations have been happening between Western scientists themselves. What needs to happen is the conversation needs to be opened up to include indigenous scientists, indigenous philosophers, in that conversation, and others, coming from other fields of study. I'm happy to say that that's happening already. I know that's happening in ecological conversations, in journals. And so this is not necessarily new, as a conversation topic. It's been ongoing. And it may have impact, I think, on really changing the way that science is viewed and understood, broadly. So yeah, that's a good question. I don't know where it's going to go, because that's kind of a much larger venue, but I think it's important to follow that and to read some of, some of the, in the 70s, I ran across a Polish philosopher. His name is Heinrich Slimowski, I believe his name. And he was writing in the 1970s. He's called eco-psychology or eco-philosophy, rather. Eco-philosophy is the term he used in the 1970s. And he was writing like an indigenous author about ecological questions and issues and the ecological paradigm that need to change. So even Western philosophers, especially in ecology, have been writing about this. One of the big names, Arnie Ness, for instance, in ecological circles has been, writing about this, wrote about this years and years ago. Others, David Orr, another Western, science, ecological philosopher, has written about this. So, so it's not that it's not out there. It's just that for whatever reason, just as Megan Bang and Doug Menden have said, the science establishment has selected to ignore it, even though the evidence is there. And there's a lot of people writing about it. Yeah.
One more question. I saw your hand.
Yes.
My name is Pete Daniel. I'm a faculty here at Columbia. And first, I just want to say thank you so much for this talk and for your work for years. I trying to decide which question I want to ask you. I have so many of them. But I think what I'll ask is maybe the more provocative question.
Yeah.
Which is much of what you spoke to today is certainly very real in the world of astronomy and physics.
Yes.
And it's impacting students. In particular, I see it in not just college students, but PhD and masters. And it's painful.
Yeah. To watch. Yes, I know. Yeah.
And given everything that you're saying and the collective sort of ecosystem of phenomena that are contributing to those experiences, is it time for us to find our own way, maybe with an institute that's really focused on?
Yes. I would say yes, yes, yes. Yes, it's time to do that, and the research is there already, and it's growing globally. So it's not just here in the United States, but it's growing globally. as Indigenous people become empowered, as they begin to address, these ecological as well as educational issues that they have in their own countries, in their own places, it's growing. And so just before COVID, I did a presentation to the Science Academy in Taiwan. And of course, Taiwan has, I think, about 12 different indigenous groups, in Taiwan. And each of them are, creating their indigenous knowledge, education systems. And so that was 6 years ago. And that momentum is carrying out. I'm doing some Zooms to Nigeria next week, for their science program. And so this is not just a fly in the night. This is happening all over and I think it's very, very much time to create an institute that really begins to address these kinds of issues. And the curriculum research is really a process that I think can really bring forward, this kind of change, this kind of transformation. And it's good for Western science. It's important for Western science, as much as it is important for Indigenous people in participating in science, So I would say yes, yes, yes. Yes.
PhD candidate better for the study of higher education.
Okay.
I'm curious as to how you rate some of the critiques Ryan Deloria has about using science as a strength.
Yeah, Biden was a good mentor of mine. He was one of the mentors on my PhD program. So I've had this conversation. I'm aware of that predisposition. He was really, actually really an advocate for Indigenous science. He was one of the persons that really supported my early work when I wrote about Look to the Mountain and told him about what I was doing at IIA. And he actually came and visited one of my classes when I was still doing it at IIA. So he was very much a champion for Indigenous science. But he was suspicious, as I noticed Keith James, who was also a colleague of mine, he wrote about science in Native communities. And he talked about why Indigenous people tend to be very suspicious of science because of the histories that they have had with scientific research and the extractive nature of scientific research that many of them remember in their communities. And so that was his fear, that we would buy into extractive science research. And I said, no, what we're extracting from is our own history, our own understanding of what science is, and then building on that to, in a sense, regenerate a form and expression of science that is Indigenous oriented.
But I guess what I'm talking about is the idea that what our ancestors were creating wasn't science, but it was actually metaphysics. So it will exist at a much larger level.
Yeah, it always, but we call it science today. But yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. It was a form of metaphysics that where the science was the kind of the practical, expression, So the architecture in Chaco Canyon was a byproduct of that metaphysical aspect,
I understand, but I guess what I'm trying to get to is the idea that what he speaks about later on, when he takes on creationism, evolutionism, and other modern myths and the book that he wrote, was the idea that science itself is a framework that creates its own canon of thought, much like a religion.
Yeah.
And that it becomes this self-referential thing that then also creates a situation where, again, science in and of itself creates and leads us down the path.
Yeah.
And so how do we, and I guess what I'm starting to think about with my work is the idea of, it's not necessarily the framework that's changed, because let's think about it. The framework has always been science. We've just been substituting different philosophies through history and time.
Right.
And we still produce the same thing. And so I have to bring in the work of Dr. B.F. Cordova, who's a philosopher, talks about this idea that when you establish the foundational framework of a people,
Yeah,
you also define for them what is true, what is real, and what is possible.
true.
So then now you get a scenario where if you're creating knowledge across cultures, there's some things that within some cultures are not true or real or possible,
Yes.
but are entirely possible in another
And in the culture
So how do
tradition.
you now validate reality across cultures is what I hear your work saying. But the problem is we have to do that deep work of figuring out that what can exist within one framework of understanding, specifically indigenous frameworks overall. There's some truths there that cannot be seen or understood by science, no matter how much you use that framework.
And I absolutely agree with you. And those are the kinds of things that we have to begin to talk about, debate, research. But we, at this point, we don't quote unquote have a curriculum that helps us to navigate, those questions and those issues. And that's what I'm advocating, is that we need something like a curriculum, that really allows us to, and those boxes, those little Western boxes, a hell of a lot of research happens in each one of those that's required if you're going to do this kind of work. Yeah, so no, I agree with what you're saying. I use Viola's book. I knew her, at University of New Mexico. I knew her, and we had a lot of interesting conversations, about her work, and so what I'm saying is that the curriculum can be designed where you can have these kinds of important conversations about how to actually understand, the differences as well as the parallels between, Western worldview and Native worldview. Otherwise, you have what my student in Canada calls the intractable conflict. The intractable conflict, you're stuck, and we're stuck right now. We're stuck in our little silos, and we have to begin to understand how to build bridges in multiple kinds of ways between our knowledge systems. And ultimately, I think the real, how should I say, the real treasure for Native people is that we'll begin to revitalize and regenerate our thinking and our forms of science, into the future, which is about sustaining our cultures into the future, ultimately. So that's my goal. I don't know if I'll stay around long enough to see that, but that's the goal. That's the real goal. So.